Disciple of Christ podcast, Who Killed Joseph Smith, Debunked. And guess who I have with me to make sure that we've got it thoroughly debunked? Justin, don't know your middle name, Griffin. Thank you for joining the Disciple of Christ podcast.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So I did have you early on. Well, when I first started doing kind of a spiritual journey interviews, you were one of the early ones. I do have to admit, I feel like I kind of sucked at interviews at the time. You and I only got about 48 minutes worth of stuff. And I feel like there should have been a whole lot more. Maybe some of that will be a part of this interview, but I plan to dive in deep. You ready for that?
Yeah, sure.
Part 2 is out of Who Killed Joseph Smith. In part 1, you spend time lining out the different theories regarding how Joseph Smith was killed, how was actually killed. There's a few different people, mainly a part of LDS proper, that believe the shots that killed, or the shots that hit Joseph and Hiram must have happened this way. And you proposed a theory which implicates John Taylor and Willard Richards. And that was received with just wide open arms by people in general, wasn't it?
Not so much.
Why? Let me ask this. Why would you go for something that's so shocking to the senses that those who have led the church afterwards are directly implicated in murdering Joseph and Hiram?
Well, the goal, I don't know. The goal of that film was just to discover the truth. And as I stated in that film, I watched a video online called Carthage Conspiracy. And they were the ones that suggested it was an inside job. And they, theorized about how that happened. And I was able to disprove their theory very quickly, or at least to my own satisfaction. And part of the way I was able to do that was I read all the other guys that had theories out and studied all of the other different theories that were out there. And so I began testing all of their theories as well, and thought that there were strengths and weaknesses to each of those. So they didn't answer the question all the way. But what I did answer through that process is that there is no way that the current narrative, the narrative that the church tells about the martyrdom, is correct. There's no way it can be correct. And I think by the end of that film, anyone who saw that film agrees with that. Anyone who's looked into Carthage at all agrees with that. The two main eyewitnesses contradict each other. They can't both be right. So that, I would say, is the biggest success of that film, is people starting to actually question the narrative.
Yeah, there's something I want to point out. Whenever it's conspiracy or else doubting the official story, the process that I go through is, what is the official claim, and does that withstand scrutiny? Whether it's questions about the JFK assassination, 9/11, or the assassination of Joseph and Hiram Smith, what official story, does it stand up to scrutiny? And I have yet, with very few exceptions, it seems like everybody is in agreement that details like muskets, John Taylor's watch, and the entry and exit of the wound through the head of Hiram are all things that, what we know, the official story on those details cannot be true. Is that the general consensus that you've seen in people responding to your movie?
Yes. So everybody has a different idea on which things contradict the narrative. But, one of the most popular ones is John Taylor's watch. Of all the people I've talked with, which is up there, there is only one that still believes that watch was shot. And all the rest of them are like, yeah, the watch wasn't shot.
From what you can gather, the believing that it was shot, is it based upon physical evidence, or is it based upon belief in the miraculous?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't remember them justifying that belief, but what I do remember is this person feels like once you start questioning the narrative, then you open the door for all these other questions. And so he's like, it's better to not open that door. So let's just assume however that happened, it happened.
Okay. Let me move on to the second movie, because that came out and it was a packed screening. It looked like there was only standing room available, very packed house, and it's generated thousands of views within the first couple of days.
Yeah, it was amazing. There was over the theater counted. There was over 500 people that were there that night. It was incredible.
Now, the movie starts off talking about your excommunication. Now, in one of towards the end of Who Killed Joseph Smith, the first part, you do put out a statement at the end shown on the screen that you and your wife, Rebecca, lost your membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a
Yeah.
direct result of that movie. And Who Killed Joseph Smith Part 2 picks up there. It's even called redemption. How much of that redemption is it personal to you, and how much of that is personal to the assassination of Joseph and Hiram?
Yes, so I was excommunicated before the film came out, before part 1 came out, and I felt like it was a little bit disingenuous. I didn't want people to accuse me of, "Oh, you're just trying to attack the church," and all this stuff. So I put that disclaimer at the end of the movie. "Look, I got excommunicated for this. This is who I am. If you need to figure that into your process for what this all means to you, there you go." But I didn't talk about the effects of that or how that, showed up in my life. So yeah, I picked that back up in part 2. And the redemption in part 2 is 3. First and foremost, it's praising the Lord for redeeming us. And that's the redemption that matters, is his redemption. And I put a giant Easter egg in the movie to show that redemption. And so far, only one person has picked up on that.
Oh my
and found
goodness, I'm gonna have to watch it again. Are you gonna give
Yeah,
me the Easter egg?
if you understand the doctrine of Christ, you should see it.
Okay.
So if you don't see it, I'm like, Jacob, what's going on with you? How come you don't understand the doctrine of Christ?
Oh, well, can I give my theory on just recalling the movie right now? The
Sure.
whole out in the wilderness and escaping out of the wilderness is the doctrine of Christ.
Yes, which part of the doctrine of Christ is that?
Well, and I'm thinking of the way that it was depicted in Lehi's dream, where he followed a man dressed in white, and what happened as a result of that led into a dark and dreary waste. Only after
Yeah.
recognizing, following this man left in white left me here, calls upon the Lord with all his might, and only then is he shown the path which leads to the tree of life.
Right.
Did I get it? Did I get it?
No,
No.
but I agree with you. But there's an even bigger symbolic journey of Lehi's family. They literally go into the wilderness for 8 years.
Yeah.
And it didn't need to be 8 years. It didn't take 8 years to leave Jerusalem and get to Bountiful. But why did it take 8 years? Because they took forever before they finally stopped rebelling against God and listened to his commandments. So what happens? In the wilderness, they are not able to use fire. Then they get to Bountiful and they're able to use fire. What does that mean, Jacob?
Ooh, I did see a link that's been floating around regarding why they didn't use fire in the
No,
wilderness.
don't think about it in practical terms. Think about it symbolically. What is that step representing? Bountiful.
Oh, the bountiful, probably entering the gate, the baptism of fire and the
Yes.
Holy Ghost.
Yes. So in the wilderness, you're just trying to figure
They are
out how to
there
go to
without fire, have
God and
not
follow
entered
the
the gate.
commandments. You're wandering around, you're fighting, you're rebelling. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. When you finally humbled yourself, yeah, you get into Bountiful and you get this small period of rest. You get fire again. You have all this spontaneous fruit. It is an amazing
Why
place.
don't we
That's
just
symbolic
stay
of the
here?
first
It
chapter.
it would be
Yes.
easy to feel like, why don't we just stay here?
Yes, and as you know, yours lasted 4 days. Um, it doesn't last. Now you start the journey.
The tough
And what
stuff.
was their journey? Their straight and narrow path journey was across the water.
Jeez
And
Louise.
what's at the end of that is the promised land. So that is the doctrine of Christ. And you nailed it in it's the gate. Out of the wilderness, you enter the gate.
Okay. I'm gonna
That's the last clue I'm gonna give you.
Okay, so let me rein you in a little bit, because there's some things that are important to understand why the frustration with what you're pointing out before we get into some of the specific details, whether they are debunked or not. There's some people who love to use that word, and I'm not sure if they mean what that word actually means.
No.
But the narrative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is founded upon the following story. Joseph Smith held all of the keys regarding the restoration, authorization to build temples, the keys regarding salvation and exaltation, in as much as they're going to be administered in this earthly realm. And before Joseph Smith died, those keys were given to Brigham Young and the rest of the Quorum of the 12 shortly before he's assassinated. Those keys are preserved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, all of them held by Russell M. Nelson. And for you to start sharing a narrative by which those keys are called into place, you're literally saying the foundation upon which the Church of Jesus... Hold on, it went mute for a little bit. The foundation, well, let me say it. Well, let me give myself a thing so I know to edit right there. What you're saying is the foundation upon which the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is built is false. How could you expect to have kept your membership if you're promoting such an idea?
Right. So I find it endlessly fascinating that people will defend John Taylor and Willard Richards and even Brigham Young, that they can do no wrong, but they have no problem throwing Joseph, Hiram, and Emma under the bus and just thrashing their names. I'm like, why do you have to defend John Taylor and Willard Richards so vehemently? And it's exactly what you're talking about. Because that puts into question that line of authority. And that line of authority is what they have based their whole testimony on. And I can say that because I've been there. I did that and you did that. And authority is everything in the church. We have the authority. So yeah, when I come out with a theory that questions that authority, it's questioning the whole hierarchical structure of the church. It's, cuts at the very root of what they exist for. So I didn't know when I made the first film that that's what I was trying to do. I just wanted to understand, what happened in Carthage. And I don't think asking questions about the narrative would have gotten me into trouble, because if it did, all those other guys that ran their own studies would have gotten into trouble.
Let me
Where I got into trouble is coming up with a theory.
So let me push back. There are people online and inside of the church, people who put out publications, many different places, who view themselves very sincerely defending Joseph and Hiram Smith and the restoration itself by teaching what they believe is the accurate history that Joseph Smith restored polygamy because of divine mandate and intervention from God. The same way he received other revelations, he received celestial plural marriage, and that is an inescapable part of the restoration. So for you to even call that into question is rejecting, at least in part, the restoration of Jesus Christ's gospel.
I don't know if you watched the podcast where Brian Hales was on with Michelle Stone on hers. He straight up said, you're allowed to believe whatever you want in your house, but outside of your house, if you want to remain a member in good standing, you cannot say anything that goes against what the 15 teach. And I was like, man, that must stink being a historian and looking up stuff in the historical documents. Because if you find something that goes against that, you're not allowed to say it. And I'm like, how do you even consider yourself an integritous person?
It reminds me of a meme. Somebody sent me a meme where it says church leadership, and it's a mom pushing one of those little carts with a boy inside, and it says Mormons, the little boy there. And as he thinks he's driving the cart, the car says personal revelation. In other words, it seems to describe, well, there's a system in place. You can get revelation as long as it's where we're pushing you.
Right. So Dallin Oaks, a member of the first presidency, one of the high in the 15, wrote Carthage Conspiracy, his book. So he's done a lot of study on Carthage. And I guess him being an apostle, that's what's the accepted narrative, is whatever he says. But he didn't write that as an apostle. And there's many problems, in my opinion, with that book. So I'm like, why can't they just be dedicated to the truth? Why can't you just say, here's what I found, and then they come out and say, yeah, maybe that's right, maybe it's not. Well, look, why does it have to be, no, you're excommunicated first, and then we'll look at your questions later and decide if that's important or not? I don't.
Well, here's what
that's a good way to approach it.
here's what came up right away. Hey, if you're implicating John Taylor and Willard Richards, and Brigham Young took the reins of the church in the absence of Joseph and Hiram, you're framing Brigham Young for murder, or at least implying that he's a part of the murder of Joseph and Hiram. Did people catch you on that accurately?
Yeah, well, a lot of people wondered why in the first two films I never mentioned Brigham Young, because they all think that I'm pinning the whole thing on Brigham Young. I'm like, my study was on the 2 to 3 minutes in Carthage where the mob was there and Joseph and Hiram were actually killed. And I don't believe that Brigham was there. So it's immaterial. He is immaterial to what I study and what I focus on. So how he's involved in the motivation and all that, we'll see. But he was not, I'm not one of those people that believe he was there and had anything to do with what happened in those 2 to 3 minutes.
Let me talk about some of the things from the official LDS narrative. So, I mean, first off, we kind of already covered this. Maybe we'll just keep it short. Isn't the murder, the martyrdom of Hiram and Joseph Smith, isn't that already settled? Don't you trust the science?
Okay, so nobody says, don't you trust the science? They say, don't you trust the historical record? And this one, I know you've been in the battle on polygamy forever. And the polygamy...
Well, not since 2020. I was in the polygamy camp up until January 2020.
Right. The polygamy debate is... there's many more people in that debate, and there's so many more people that have done, deep dives into that, figuring out what actually happened there. Lots of opinions, lots of papers, lots of studies, lots of everything. But Carthage got overlooked. And I think the way that it was overlooked is they thought that one was answered, not a problem there. So when I come and ask questions, no one's ever studied it. People say, well, the historians say that's already solved. And I'm like, no, they don't. They don't even comment on it. Where's the books? Where's the studies? Where's the papers on what happened? That's all pretty recent. And it's not even from historians. It's from guys like me who said this doesn't look right and start running tests and writing what they think happened. So there's just not a body of work there for the church to defend. But instead of admitting that, they all just say, you're stupid, your theory is dumb, you're biased, you have a bone to pick, all that kind of stuff.
Well, because you mentioned bias, and you already mentioned Brian Hales, and he did make it very clear in his conversation with Michelle Stone, you are not allowed to publicly go against what's taught by the 15. It indicates that with all of the volumes of works that he's put out, it's an undeniable investment in research and putting things together. But people have to recognize at a fundamental religious level for Brian Hales and probably anybody who's employed by the church or at least believes that they're in good standing in the church, they know they're not allowed to come to conclusions that are different than the 15 at the top. It's just not allowed. Brian Hales makes that incredibly clear.
Yes, and as we've discussed before, that leaks into everything. That's not just the history. That's in your scripture study. You are not allowed to read this verse and come up with an answer from the Spirit that goes against anything the 15 have taught. Now, he makes the caveat, in your own home, you can say whatever, but outside you can't. So if you read some verse and you get a different interpretation, you bring that up in Sunday school, you are out of line. And yeah, all of the guys that studied Carthage before, they fell into that. You can't say anything contrary to what the church's official narrative is that threatens their authority in any way. But I was like, when I did it, I was like, no, I just want to know what the truth is. I don't care which way it is. So I was able to look at it, oddly enough, less biased than they were. And yet everyone accuses me of being so biased. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm the first one that looked at it like, I'm not under this. I have to say what the church says. I can say wherever the evidence leads. I was way less biased.
Let me ask this. In getting ready for part number 2, you did a whole bunch of research regarding the historical record. So that was a significant portion of the second movie. When I started to investigate Joseph Smith's polygamy with the first time in my life, from the possibility that he wasn't a polygamist. I had never even considered that a possibility. Never asked it ever. I was fully expecting to see, all right, well, it's stacking up this much in the affirmative, this much in the negative. Maybe one of them's inching out. It was quite lopsided in the direction of, hey, this is a narrative that was created after Joseph and Hiram were assassinated.
Right.
How are things stacking up as far as trying to investigate everything that you can, whether the assassination happened by those on the inside or a mob coming from the outside, stacking up in the affirmative or the negative? What was it?
So ask that again.
How are things
historical
stacking up? When you were researching the historical record on whether Joseph and Hiram were assassinated by those on the inside of the jail,
Okay.
were the evidences more balanced this side or the other, or were they more lopsided,
Okay.
indicating one side or the other?
Well, in the historical record, you can't tell. It's a mess. So many different stories, so many different people, different timing, different wounds, different who was in, different who was shooting. I mean, to the point, like one guy, William Daniels, says Joseph was not wounded inside of the jail at all. He fell out of the window, and then the only wounds he received was they shot him on the ground. Then Brackenberry, or I think it was Brackenberry, on the other hand, said no. Joseph was, when he came to the window, was already bleeding. All of that happened inside of the jail. When he came out of the ground, laid on the ground, nobody touched him. That's exact opposite. So it's like, who do you believe, or how do you make sense of two people who saw the same thing and told completely different stories like that?
Can't both be true.
Right. So that's why I'm like, you know what? All the people that think that the narrative is solved with the historical, I'm like, what historical are you reading? This doesn't prove anything. These are all like, and then it turns into the polygamy debate, right? Where you have to, like, the people on one side are like, well, that guy that said that, we don't trust his account. We trust the guy who said the thing that backs up what we think the narrative is. And I'm okay, because I'd probably do that too. That's part of the bias. And that's why I'm like, let's start talking about the accounts. One by one, we can go through in the detail and say, okay, what do you think? Why is this guy accurate or not accurate? And what's his background? What's the context? And we can go account by account. And I think that would be a lovely exercise. I'd be willing to do that with anybody.
Well, in putting together a movie that's really founded upon, hey, I already made a part one where I implicate John Taylor and Willard Richards. There has to be at least the implication of bias on your part in how you're now evaluating the historical record.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one of the main, the people who have a problem with the movie, the critics, is they say, you're biased. You're biased. And I say, I know. Next. And I can admit at this point that I am biased. In the first movie, I was way less biased, but now I'm pretty convinced of what the evidence is saying. I know I'm biased, and I can't even correct for it, like personally, because I believe that. And now that affects the way that I see the historical account, that affects how I see everything, which, by the way, has allowed me to find things in the historical account that were never found before. So I'm not even 100% sure that bias was wrong to have. But what's crazy is the way that I think I can overcome that bias is by talking with other people.
Yeah.
And like, you read it and you tell me against your bias, and let's see if our biases cancel each other out and weigh each other. What point is there in you just tearing me down and saying I'm biased? Why don't you say what you think the evidence means, and I'll say what I think, and see if we can arrive to some, agreement in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So prior to me doing the Disciple of Christ podcast, I spent years doing a political podcast. The exercise that I would go to regularly is, when there's something that I'm investigating, what is the most well-respected hardened bias on this side? What's the most well-respected and hardened bias on the other side? And there's actually a significant amount of, they at least agree on these details. They vary quite widely on what that implies. But all of the details where they say, well, we're not disputing that, we're not disputing that, I would focus on that. These things are not disputed. In other words, I find I actually find far more value when somebody has a strong opinion, as long as I can weigh it against other respectable people that have an opposite opinion and
Yeah.
find, well, because here's what I've noticed so far. Those who vehemently denounce the conclusion that you've come to, they agree John Taylor's watch was not hit
Right.
by any sort of a firearm, whether it be a pistol or whether it be a musket.
Right.
There's generally consensus that it was not musket damage on John Taylor's body, and it was not a musket that exited Hiram's skull.
Right.
So, in other words, those sort of details are completely against the LDS narrative, yet
Right.
yet they're generally agreed upon by those who have
Yeah.
come to polar opposite conclusions.
Yes, I totally agree with you. First and foremost, it's like, okay, we're going to have a conversation. Do you think that the narrative is correct? And they say the better word is accurate. No, I don't believe it's 100% accurate. I'm like, okay, cool. We both agree that it's not 100% accurate. Now we can take the next step. And whatever you say about my methods and about my bias and about my approach, you know what? Through all of that, I think it is sufficiently proven that the shot that killed Hiram, that hit him in the head, entered here and exited out of his side of his nose. Now, there's going to be people that say that's stupid and that's dumb and all that. But the guys who look at it and look at the evidence, even when they're on the other side, say, yeah, I think that's the way that went down. The detective with 2,000 homicides under his belt, investigations, who is an expert in shot pattern analysis, agreed that's the shot. So I'm like, okay, we know the narrative is not right and we know that's the shot. So what happened? And from there, I'm like, okay, now you can disagree with me all you want and I'm cool with it. But tell me what you think happened and I'll tell you what I think happened and let's test each other and push back and forth. And that is where I think the strongest theory will emerge in time, is the people who admit that was the shot and then come up with ideas of how that happened. You have to explain that. The detective came up with his. Here, this was his theory of how he thought that shot was made. And I mean, right off the bat, I was like, I don't think so. But I'm working to test that. But and there's other people who've come up with theories of how that shot could have been made, and that's where I find the most helpful. I'll help anyone and talk them through whatever, but the ones that advance the actual search for truth, admit those two things and then start working on that. And if you want to prove that the church is true and that shot happened and the narrative is fine and they weren't lying, that's great. I mean, I'll have that discussion with anybody.
So if you're seeing what is on the screen right now, it is not for the squeamish. You might want to go audio only if that can affect you. In movie number one, there was a loud, very small chorus of people saying, you didn't do forensic investigation. In part number one, you're not qualified. It's a highly specialized field. And it seems like in part two, you went overboard in this. Was that your intention to go overboard? The kind of ballistics testings that you did, what was the goal?
Yeah, in the first one, I used a shotgun with a round slug, which I calculated the velocity on it as less than the velocity of would have been shot out of a musket. So I thought I was fine in running some tests. Man, the people were so upset by that. So I was like, okay, on this one, I got the actual black powder rifles, the actual musket from that time, and rifle and pistol, and shot them with all different caliber size of balls and all different amounts of black powder. And nobody's disputing it anymore. Nobody is
Yeah,
saying
I've yet to
anything
find
on
that.
that
I
one.
have yet to find that where people are disputing that your methods in the first film, that was loud among that small group of people,
Yeah.
that it just wasn't qualified. You meant to go overboard.
Yeah. So before the headshots, I did way more tests where I shot through half-inch pieces of black walnut to simulate the panel in the door into wood. And that's where I was shooting with all sorts of different sizes and grains to see the damage of the wood on the other side, 2x4s on the other side. And I went through all of that with the detective. And that's how I determined, okay, if you shoot this thing with 100 plus grains of powder, it's like a cannon. So we determined the shots that we want to test on the actual gel heads are the musket, the 69 caliber musket with 80 grains, the rifle with a 50 caliber ball with only 50 grains, and then a pistol with a 50 caliber ball at 25 grains. And I shot it through all of the wood and it still penetrated all of the wood, no problem. And the detective's like, oh, good heck. And then we measured all of those shots in the door because a 69 caliber ball that went through the panel of the door only measured at 0.52 inches. And so then we had a big long discussion about how the ball can change or the wood can contract. And I didn't show any of that in the film, but I'll show that later on. I mean, we proved that hole through the door was shot through with a 69 caliber musket, but there's no way that that ball could have hit Hiram. I mean, I shot through it with only 25 grains of powder with a pistol, and it still exited his head twice. So I'm like, dude, there is no argument anymore. That shot through the door did not strike Hiram. There is no argument there.
So I have yet to read the narrative of the assassination, the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith from the current Saints manual, but I've heard it so many times growing up. I feel like I can give it the LDS proper treatment with the right amount of gravitas and even a little bit of a appropriate dramatic presentation, where I know that Joseph and Hiram were up in the jail cell in Carthage with John Taylor and Willard Richards. John Taylor was asked to sing A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief. He didn't sing it a second time because he wasn't feeling all that up about it. Mob comes storming up the stairs. There's gunshots from the muskets that are going through. There's efforts to use canes to push the muskets up. Hiram gets hit first. I am a dead man. Joseph goes over to him, puts himself up towards the window, takes at least one shot, goes outside. There's more shots that happen after that. It is a fury of musket balls and blasts. And somebody yells, "The Mormons are coming." And the mob scatters immediately. And the aftermath of Joseph and Hiram are left there on the ground. That's the story that I've heard from my teenage years and probably earlier than that throughout my whole life.
Not bad. So interestingly, people are always, John Taylor and Willard Richards are the ones that only mentioned muskets with bayonets and rifles. And the mob was shoving them through the door, making it halfway through the door, belching out huge flames as the size of his forearm. That's all they mentioned was bayonets and rifles. And people are like, well, that's not fair. The mob probably would have had pistols. And I'm like, I believe they did have pistols. Of course they would have pistols.
I think
I'm not the one that said that they had muskets and rifles.
Well, I never
mentioned pistols.
I noticed that people are trying to say you need to be more understanding if the eyewitness accounts don't match up with the physical evidence, because it's notorious that eyewitness accounts simply won't.
So let's say that there was different guns firing into the room. Clearly, most of them would have been muskets, but some could have got some pistol shots. Whatever. There are 12 wounds in that room.
12 wounds? Tell me what you're saying about the 12 wounds inside of there.
Okay, so there's 12 wounds inside of the room. 4 in John Taylor, 4 in Joseph, 4 in Hiram. Not one of those wounds was caused by a musket or a rifle. Every single one of them was a small caliber wound. So I'm like, okay, all they're describing is muskets and rifles making it through the door. Someone snuck a pistol in. Whoever the pistol shooter was the Deadeye that got every one of all 12 shots.
Well, because that pepper box pistol was the maximum amount of possible rounds, right? 6 shots is the max from one weapon.
Right. So yeah, where'd those 12 shots come from? And here's my question to you that I have a theory on, but I want you to try and answer it.
Goodness, putting me on the spot.
Yes. Why would they not mention pistols? Why did they avoid pistols in their description?
If I'm exploring the possibility that Willard and John are avoiding implication in the death of Joseph and Hiram, it would be because they could covertly smuggle pistols in. It would not be very possible to covertly smuggle in muskets.
Yes, that's not bad. In my feeling, the only pistols that are mentioned in their whole narrative are in the room.
In the
You
possession
know,
of Joseph and his brother Hiram.
Joseph had a 6-shooter and Hiram had a single shot.
Yeah. In other words, the two
But
that
why did they not want to tie anything to pistols? They wanted to tie it all to muskets and rifles.
well, because it would indicate the shootout happened in the room.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's exactly
Shootout
what I
happened
think.
in the room.
Now, to get the official narrative, everything you said in your description of the narrative, they've cut it way down from that. Now it's just like a paragraph or two in this chapter. If you go to Carthage and go through the tour, they will and say what happened at Carthage. They don't tell you what happened at Carthage. They just sing "O Poi where fang man of grief" and walk around and say this is the kitchen, but they don't tell you what happened there. And if you ask what happened there, they refer you to this book. And you can see right there in the picture of the book whose hands are against the door when that bullet's coming through.
It's probably indicating Hiram because the narrative is he took a shot to the skull and then exclaimed, "I am a dead man."
So the church put this picture out to go along with this chapter, and they're saying that Hiram was against the door when he shot with this picture. Now, Hiram, according to the narrative of the eyewitnesses, was 10 feet back. That's why right off the bat, they have changed. Now, they adopted that from the Lyon brothers theory. That's where they get that Hiram was at the door. So the church with this picture is admitting the narrative is not correct. They've admitted that the watch story wasn't correct, and they've admitted Hiram wasn't 10 feet back. Now, if you scroll down, you know, you have a lot of stuff about, you know, what was going on at the time, but the actual, when you get to what happened in the room, the 2 to 3 minutes that I care about, you'll see how little there is.
So here's something from the chapter, "A Lamb to the Slaughter" in the Saints Manual.
Yes. And you got an idea of that whole chapter and all the scrolling to get to this, how long all the other details are. And now we're going to actually talk about the 2 to 3 minutes. And it says, a few minutes later, the prisoners heard a rustling at the door and the crack of 3 or 4 gunshots. Willard glanced out the open window, saw 100 men below.
100 men below.
Yes, he later changes that to 150 to 250, and then changes that to 150 to 200, and finally settles on 150 to 200. Anyway, Willard glanced out the open window and saw these men storming the entry of the jail, mud and gunpowder. No. Joseph grabbed one of the pistols while Hiram seized the other. John and Willard picked up canes, gripping them like clubs. All 4 men pressed themselves against the door, and the mob rushed up the stairs. This says all 4 men pressed against the door. John Taylor says it was only Hiram and Willard that pressed up against the door. So they're going with the Willard account here, which Willard says all 4 of them pressed up against the door. While the mob rushed up, tried to force their way inside. That forced their way inside. The only people that ever say that is Willard and John, and it wasn't until their final accounts. None of them talk about it in the beginning. In Willard's very first account, he says, we heard the shots. Next thing we know, they shot through the door. There was no pushing back and forth at the door until his 7th account is when he mentions that. None of the mob said there's any pushing back and forth against the door, but
was he mentioning canes to push up the muskets before that?
So same thing. The canes were never mentioned until Willard's 7th account, as he finally puts the details in about the canes.
And you mentioned something inside of the movie that as you guys were recreating muskets being pushed up by canes, what happened to the canes used as props on the set?
Yeah, so they were distinctly marked with deep grooves and you can see them on the cane. And that was enough to make me think, well, because Willard, you know, I don't remember if you were on the shoot or not, but we didn't do that too much. Willard and John acted like they were doing that for a long time, hitting those canes back and forth. There should have been damage on that stick. Go to the museum, go look at it. There are no grooves in that cane that's preserved. So I would love to actually reduplicate that cane and then go run tests and see if the damage that's caused on it matches at the museum. That'd be a fun study. Anyway, so we go on in this account. Joseph grabbed a pistol. Hiram seized the other. John and Willard pick up canes. They try and force their way inside. Scoot down. Gunfire sounded in the stairwell as the mob shot at the door. Joseph, John, and Willard sprang to the side of the doorway. Again, Willard first said he remained behind the door the whole time in his first account, but then he changes that and is like, no, I was on the left with Joseph and John. The ball splintered through the wood. It struck Hiram in the face. They don't talk about 2 gunshots here, which in Willard's full account, he says the first came above the doorknob and then the second came through the panel. But in his very first, he only talks about 1 shot that comes through the panel. That was the first thing. He doesn't ever mention the second shot. So this says, as it splintered through the wood, it struck Hiram in the face and he turned stumbling away from the door. So their official account now puts Hiram at the door instead of 10 feet back, like both eyewitnesses said he was 10 feet back. The church changed that, say he's at the door, turned and stumbled, and then another hit him in the lower back from the door, where the official is, they say it came through the window and hit him.
And there's nothing in here anymore about Hiram exclaiming after being shot.
Yes, because that makes no sense that he would be able to say
he would get hit in the face and say, I am a dead man.
And then it says his pistol fired and he fell to the floor, because there are so many critics that have said Hiram never fired that pistol. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Willard said he did. The church said he did. And they're like, we have proof of that, but they've never produced that proof. I'd love it if they did. I'd love to see that. Brother Hiram, Joseph cried, gripping his 6-shooter. He opened the door a few inches and fired once. See where he's saying he opened the door? They're saying before that the door was never open. That's Willard's story. The mob doesn't say that. They say we fired through the door and it flew open. So who do you believe? That leads me into a whole nother theory. Why did Willard have to keep the door closed and say it was barely ever opened? It's so that he didn't ever have to identify anyone from the mob. Somebody comes home from witnessing the killing. What's the first question everyone's going to ask you? What did they look like? Willard or Taylor never gave a description. Never said if they were tall or short or skinny or just wearing this or had long hair. They never described the guys in the jail. And why wouldn't they do that? Because there's only so many guys there. You could have pinpointed who did the shot if they would have given a simple description. And they didn't want that to happen. They didn't really want to identify who the killer was if the killer was outside of that room for some reason, because that guy would have contradicted their testimony. So Willard came up with the story. The door was never open. Then he could just say, we never saw him. The door was never open. It was only ever a couple of inches when Joseph opened it. And that preserved their testimony. It was a genius on their part. But again, it goes against the mob who said when we shot, that door flew open. Anyway, Joseph opens a few inches and fired once. More musket balls flew into the room, and Joseph fired haphazardly at the mob while John used a cane to beat down the gun barrels. Has that ever made sense to you that he's firing through? Why wouldn't they just blow his head off right then and there? Why would they keep firing when he's firing at them on the stairwell? This new narrative that they've changed it. I'm like, man, you guys didn't think this through at all. After Joseph's revolver misfired 2 or 3 times, again, there's the big detail that both John and Willard, with everything that they messed up, they both know he misfired 3 times. Why did they have to say that detail? Why did they go out of their way to say that he misfired 3 times?
There's something specific about that number. If it holds 6 shots total and 3 of them we know were aimed at the mob, we can't have 3 other bullets causing wounds inside of that room.
That's right. So he fired them all out there at the mob, not at us. So they
all 6 shots aimed outside of the room. 3 of them misfired, and the other 3 went outside the room.
So after Joseph's out of bullets, now John runs to the window. Interestingly, that story, changes over time. Musket ball flew across the room and struck him in the leg, tipping him off balance. His body went numb and he crashed against the windowsill, smashing his pocket watch. So now their official narrative is he wasn't shot in the watch. He fell into the windowsill. And That's what broke the watch. I'm shot, he cried. John dragged himself across the floor and rolled under the bed. They don't put it in here where he's falling out of the window and that shot to the watch pushed him back in. That was his narrative and Willard's narrative.
I've heard that story since I was in primary. I used to repeat it as
That's
a
the
young
big
man.
faith building story. Is he was shot and the watch saved him. Now, if you go to the LDS.org website and look this up, they say, he fell against the window, so he was falling out. We don't know what pushed him back in. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. He was saved by a miracle. And I'm like, okay. I brought the miracle theory up with the detective, and he wasn't buying it.
Yeah. Well,
and then with me with the miracle theory, I'm like, if anybody needed a miracle in that room, was it John Taylor or was it Joseph and Hiram?
Joseph and Hiram needed the miracle. Why would it only apply to the others?
Right. Okay, so I guess we don't have to go through this in detail, but you can see this official church narrative. They've changed it from the official. And the thing that they changed it to, they just followed the Lyon Brothers theory. And I'm like, the Lyon Brothers theory was fantastic. It was when they did it, man, it was groundbreaking. But now that has been disproven that couldn't have happened. And the detective is like, there's no way that theory happened. And he goes through that in the movie. So now the church has admitted the watch was shot. The church has admitted he wasn't shot 10 feet back from the door. They've admitted that the shot is really one shot. They don't say that in here. The Lyon Brothers are the ones that came up with the idea that it was one shot. All I did was say, no, the shot was through the chin, not through the nose. And now we have to figure out the next step in this whole thing is, how do you get a shot like this? How do you get that angle? There's only so many ways that shot could have been made.
I've seen you hold up the anatomically correct human skull and simply put a rod through it, and it is a straight line from under the neck through out the nose.
It actually goes back this way, which is why the Lyon Brothers theory can't work, is because there's no way to shoot through the nose down that doesn't hit the body.
Yeah.
I've tried every angle. We've tried it with the full skeleton. We've tried it against it. We've done we've done it all. You can't shoot that shot that doesn't hit the body. The only way, that's another one of the proofs of the shot had to come through here. Now here you can get a gun under here and you can make that shot and it won't hit anything else. And the detective's the one that came up with the great observation that the splatter on Hiram's arm could have been from that shot. And now imagine my surprise when in the historical account, I found that J.W. Woods, Joseph's attorney, describes that shot. Came through the chin.
Ooh, there we go.
Came through the chin, and the coroner said the same thing. It came through the chin. I'm like, hey, the physical evidence proved this before I knew that the historical evidence said it, but it was right there in the historical, the whole. I'm like, that's why I'm like, man, that's what it was. That was the shot. Now, can we all work together to come up with a theory to explain how you make a shot like that Willard and Taylor, whatever that shot was, how did they come up with their explanation? Their explanation was so far off of that. It's like, what were they? I think they had to have been lying.
There's some people who have been very, very vocal in criticizing you, even those who are very respected in the LDS research community. Here's one of them, Dan Peterson. He's a contributor at FAIR. He's from pathos.com. He wrote up an article called Slandering the Lord's Anointing. The first paragraph that he dedicates to responding to you is, there is a genuinely contemptible and offensive conspiracy theory circulating out there that argues that Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith weren't actually murdered by a mob in collusion with the Carthage Greys, the local Illinois militia, as everybody, including members of the mob and of the Carthage Greys, has always thought, but instead by their cellmates in Carthage jail, elders John Taylor and Willard Richards of the Council of the 12 Apostles, perhaps at the instigation of Brigham Young, no less. To the best of my knowledge, no serious historian supports this fantasy. Those to whom I've mentioned it, in fact, have snorted derisively. So I do have to say, I can imagine this man snorting. And it turns out he's got friends that snort as well. I don't want to get too fault finding, but I'm noticing a lot of very emotionally charged language here, even to the point to where it can't be considered because the conclusion is it's already fantasy.
Right. So I've respected and followed Dan Peterson for a long time while he's in Fair. I think he's got a lot of good stuff. But after the movie came out, he ripped the first one pretty hard. And on this one, if you scroll down a little bit, he actually started out in this article and said that Joseph and Hiram weren't actually murdered by the Carthage Greys, a mob consisting of the Carthage Greys. And so he posted the link to this article on his Facebook page, and I went in and corrected him. And I was like, the Carthage Greys section, right? Is not the one. Yeah, the Carthage Greys are not the ones that made up the mob. That mob came from Warsaw. And so he didn't respond to me. He responded to everybody else that had a comment. He didn't respond to me. And then he quietly went in and changed his articles to say in collusion with the Carthage Greys.
Did he point out that he corrected it?
He did. He corrected it, and he didn't acknowledge that I was the one that pointed that detail out. And I'm like, I'm nobody, man. I have no title. I'm not a PhD. I don't have all these historians. And this seems to be the exact same case with all the historians that I talk with. They don't know Carthage. He didn't even know that it wasn't the Greys. He just throws stuff out there, assuming this is all solved. And these guys that are thumbing their nose up in derision against me, I'm like, do you even know? Do you know what the narrative is? Do you know what the church's current narrative is? Well, you know what the other theories? They don't know these details.
Just take a look at this. He really indicates that, dude, it's settled, at least in his mind, as everybody, including all these people already thought, to think any different cause involuntary snorting.
Right. That is not an argument to say you're stupid and your theory is stupid and that's
well, because any 13-year-old can use that method.
Exactly. So he's always like, I don't know who these people are. I'm not following. Maybe I'm shit. And I'm like, hey, Dan, why don't you come and look at it? And I don't even care if he's biased, obviously. He's under that same thing that we talked about earlier, where he is not allowed to say anything that goes against the 15.
Yeah. Well, it's
I'm like, great, argue that point about what really happened, and I'll argue mine. And I think through that process, certain theories, certain new ideas will start to emerge as most likely. So I'm like, defend it all you want. I don't care that you're biased. But all they want to do is say I'm contemptible and offensive and biased just to tear me down. So they don't ever actually want to talk about the evidence.
And so there's one page that has dedicated itself to the idea of debunking the Who Killed Joseph Smith movies. And they very much accuse you of making false statements. The statement that you've claimed that nobody is willing to debate you on this subject. Is that the call out that you gave in the movie?
No. Obviously I've debated many people. I've posted those debates on my YouTube channel. So I don't know if she just didn't know what she was saying or not.
I do have to point out that she has 304 likes on that Facebook page at the time of us recording this. Maybe we'll give her a little bit of a bump. About 40 of those people you and I personally know.
Right. So she, again, what I wanted to do on the movie to balance out my bias is present this evidence, both the physical and the historical, what I think it means, and then have a historian or, somebody that researches all of this stuff to come on and give the counter. And so I went to 3 of the only historians in the church who actually have done anything on Carthage and asked, would you be interested in being in this film? And they said no. And in fact, I had a full conversation with one where he asked me not to tell anyone that we had even talked. Wow. And I was like, okay,
you're toxic.
So I'm like, look, watch the movie again. What I said is nobody would be in the film. And I understand why they didn't want to be in the film. They don't want to be associated with it in any way. And they didn't, I can edit it, and they didn't want to not have control over that. So in the film, I'm inviting them. Okay, let's talk now that I understand the historical, accounts of all of this. Let's talk. So why she would say something like that, I don't know. That was just a crazy accusation just to try and cast doubt on anything I'm saying, I guess.
There's a very similar theme going on, just as we read from Dan Peterson, to where everybody already knows this. It's contemptible, the conspiracy theory. Not only is it fantasy, but if you consider it, you're going to snort. I'm noticing the same sort of theme it tends to be the leading position on the one and only page that I know of dedicated to taking your conspiracy theories down. After watching Who Killed Joseph Smith Part 2, I wasn't going to waste any of my time making any posts or commentary on it, because I think the movie itself is its own worst critic and actually debunks itself.
Yes, she has two favorite words: debunks and context. And I don't think from her usage of those words that she knows what either of them means.
You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Every time I do anything, she's like, oh, that proves it's debunked now. Oh, you're a blue shirt. Debunked. Everything's debunked. She's never debunked anything. She doesn't say, well, here's a possible thing that's questionable, and then I can answer it. No, it's always like, no, this happened. He said that he invited people to debate and didn't invite people to debate, and they've debunked. And I'm like, oh. So she doesn't get that word.
Here's been the big thing. Right when the movie came out, there was a quick transition away from responding to things that you point out: the caliber of the bullets, the size of the mob, the watch, many other details. You make a very strong case. And so it went to a selfie style video focused on the spiritual things, because here's what you are accused of. Dan Peterson's article is slandering the Lord's anointed. This page is primarily focused on the Lord has anointed Brigham Young, and you are filled with darkness by insinuating Brigham Young, Willard Richards, John Taylor, and others were involved in Joseph's death. It's just evil motive attributed to you. Isn't that a fair observation, that you're implicating these men of being involved in heinous crimes?
Yes, if they actually did do this and it was an inside job, oh yeah. Murder, I mean, it's as bad as it gets.
Okay.
Obviously, it's not on the same level as denying the Holy Ghost, but that's as bad as it gets outside of that.
You mentioned it was brought to your attention an 1848 sermon from John Taylor about not judging people accused of murder.
Yes. What kind of a crazy sermon is that to give? To give a sermon that you shouldn't judge people for committing murder because you don't know their intentions?
Yep.
I've been in a lot of church meetings. I've never heard anybody say something like that. Why was that even on his mind? Were people murdering each other for good reasons? And they just wanted to distinguish. Why would he give a sermon like that? It's so crazy.
Yeah. Well,
I don't think that sermon proves anything. But man, that's a weird one. It's a weird one.
Some things really do start causing questions when people simply look up. Within 2 weeks after the assassination of Joseph and Hiram, Samuel Smith dies under suspicious circumstances. Justin, I have to point out, you didn't mention Brigham Young at all in the first film. You didn't mention him at all in number 2, but this is how you end part number 2 of Who Killed Joseph Smith.
Maybe you still believe John Taylor and Willard Richards were telling the truth, even though the evidence contradicts their accounts of the martyrdom. Maybe the contradictions don't bother you because you know that eyewitnesses are usually mistaken. Or maybe you believe it doesn't matter because it's impossible for anyone to know exactly what happened that long ago. Or perhaps you feel it's immoral to accuse someone of a crime when they aren't alive to defend themselves. These reactions might sound reasonable, but if you believe any of them, then how can you still be so sure about polygamy? Why do you believe the self-proclaimed eyewitnesses who claim Joseph was a polygamist? How could you understand everything Joseph was doing almost 200 years ago? Why are you okay with accusing him when he isn't here to defend himself? The undeniable truth is, that from 1830 to 1844, in many printed publications, numerous public sermons, forceful letters, private journals, and highly public trials and excommunications, Joseph Smith, in concert with his brother Hiram and his beloved wife Emma, vehemently preached, relentlessly taught, indeed fiercely fought against polygamy, plurality of wives, spiritual wifery, and anything like them. In the scriptures he revealed, and in many public statements, Joseph equated any form of polygamy with adultery and whoredoms. The only private statements recorded by Joseph regarding polygamy expressly condemn and forbid the practice without exception. Some of his final words ever spoken to thousands of gathered saints just weeks before his murder were, "What a thing it is to be accused of having 7 wives when I can only find one." In contrast, there is not a single public or private statement, contemporaneous document, or verifiable action taken by Joseph Smith during his lifetime in support of or tying him to the practice, period. But still, you may be saying, well, he may have been against it publicly, but he practiced it privately, right? Well, guess who started that rumor?
Guess who started that rumor? And so now you are directly implicating Brigham Young, at least a part of the story in part 3. Why is that now becoming your focus?
So one of the crazy things about this story is how adamantly people defend John and Willard, while at the same time have no problem throwing Joseph, Hiram, and Emma under the bus. They don't mind saying that they're bad, but they will defend Willard and John. Just defend them. And I wanted in that last scene to show what people are doing. All the reasons that you think that John and Willard couldn't have done this, if you reverse them, then you should not be accusing Joseph and Hiram of practicing polygamy. And now the big connection comes together. You know, we've talked about that before, where polygamy is the big fight. That's the one where everyone's all armed with all of their historical accounts and whatnot. And nobody saw Carthage coming. But it's all tied together. It's all tied together in the fact that the narrative is not right. It's not right about Carthage. It's not right about polygamy. What else is it not right about? And if it's not right, why is it not right? Were they misremembering, or were they purposely writing the history from their bias? And I think that that's more in line probably with what happened. So we've got to look at that. We've got to understand, how did Brigham play into polygamy really? And what was his connection to those two? And what did he know about Carthage, if he knew about anything about Carthage? So that's a story that needs to be told.
Now, there are those who view that as a horrendous position to take, because you are now implicating the Lord's anointing in heinous crimes. You've already talked about that a little bit, but isn't it fair for people to view the actions of Brigham Young, Willard Richards, and John Taylor as defending the legacy of Joseph Smith? They were up close and personal when it was too dangerous to talk about celestial plural marriage. They were the ones holding the flame and keeping the doctrine alive even after the assassination of Joseph Smith. They're the real defenders of Joseph Smith, aren't they?
That's a good argument to make. And I expect that argument will be made, and I hope that it's made. And I'll present the other side, because there's a lot of people who only know the one side. Same people that only knew the one side of the narrative, who believed that Saints book, was telling it accurately, is, let's see. Will me and you and all of these other warriors that are not bound by that loyalty to, we won't ever say anything that the 15 don't approve of, that'll say, here's the records, here's what they say, and then people get to decide what that means to them. And really, that's what led into the spiritual journey in this movie, is because I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm implicating them of. And if that's all true, what that leads to is you asking, well, what does this all mean? This church that I've given my whole life to, if that narrative is not true and these guys aren't prophets, what does that all mean? And you're about to go through the wilderness if you haven't been yet. And in the wilderness, just between you and God, you're going to find out who he is and who you are and really why you're here. And I used to feel bad for that, man. Like that lady in the first premiere who was like, what do we do now? I'm just like, oh man, I know what you're about to go through and it's going to suck. But now I'm like, you know what? You got to go through it. If you want to find the Lord, you've got to ask these questions and you've got to hit them face on, and you can't just rely on anyone else. If you want to find the Lord, it's between you and him. So go find him. Go find him because he's waiting.
Justin Griffin, it has been wonderful having you again on the Disciple of Christ podcast. People can find things that you produce on YouTube if you look up Who Killed Joseph Smith. They can also look up The Lost Doctrine. Anything else they should look up besides your address so we can all go to look for you?
That's it for now.
Justin, thank you for being on the Disciple of Christ podcast.
Thanks, Jacob.